During the nation's anniversary celebration, the Trump administration has inundated the country with claims about America's Christian founding. We have seen fictitious images of George Washington praying in Pennsylvania's snow and heard false stories of Bibles being printed by Congress. Exhibits in the Smithsonian museums are being revised. The administration is sold out to the belief that America was founded as a Christian nation. In my book, The Christian Past That Wasn't, I take on 7 myths that contemporary Christian nationalists use to promote the belief that the American system of government was founded on Christianity. The myth I discuss this week involves the observation that many American colonies established one approved church. In the book, I state the matter this way: should Christianity be favored by the government now because most colonies during the nation's colonial era established Christianity then? Last season on the podcast, I spent an entire episode fact-checking claims by the late Charlie Kirk regarding his view of Christian America. One point of evidence he presented was the existence of established churches in the colonial governments. I want to replay a portion of that episode where Kirk made the claim and historian Aaron Cowan and I respond to it.
Remember that we were a collection of states and colonies, and you need to read the state constitutions before anything else. 9 out of 13 of the original states required you to be a Bible-believing Christian to serve in government at the time of the founding. Even in actually, 13 out of 13 required a declaration of faith. 9 out of 13 required you to be a Protestant, except Maryland, which was Catholic, which still required a declaration of faith. In almost every single one of the original state constitutions, Pennsylvania included, they had, "I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior," in the original state constitutions. So you remember, we're a collection of states before that.
Slippery Rock University history professor Aaron Cowan says that's a big no.
You start to pull at one thread of it and the whole thing starts unraveling and falling apart. And it doesn't take very long. You don't have to search very deeply. I think that my biggest problem is when you have just outright falsehoods in here. I mean, like his claim, the claim that in almost every single one of the original state constitutions, the text says they had, "I profess Lord and Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior" in the original state constitutions. I mean, that's just blatantly false. There were only one, I think Delaware actually includes a mention of Jesus Christ. And, the others say basically broadly Protestant faith, something like that, and some of them really just nod to it. It's like, if they're a member of a Protestant church, then that's fine.
Let me add to Aaron's remarks. Kirk changes his story in mid-claim. First, he says 9 of the 13 original states required a person holding public office to be a Bible-believing Christian. Then he says all 13 required a declaration of faith. Then he said 9 of 13 required office holders to be Protestant, except Maryland, which he said was Catholic. Then he adds another requirement for almost every state, a profession of Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. Is any of this right? First, this is a claim that is barely relevant to the legal status of the United States as a Christian nation. The Constitution declares itself the law of the land, and it does not declare any allegiance to Christianity and, in fact, forbids a requirement that office holders hold any particular religious beliefs. What the states did within their borders is interesting, but not directly relevant to the federal government. Having said that, it is true that the states varied in their requirements for holding public office before and after the Constitution was ratified. The states were not required to have the same requirements as the federal government. Let me give you some specific information about the states. There was never a time when all 13 states required a declaration of faith. Thanks to Roger Williams, Rhode Island never required any religious test for public office. Kirk was wrong about Maryland and the Catholics. Catholics were tolerated in Maryland when it was founded, but by 1718, the Church of England was the state church and Catholics lost rights to vote and hold office. As far as what people had to swear, by 1789, 5 states required office holders to be part of some Protestant denomination. 4 required a more general Christian belief. As Aaron said, only one state, Delaware, specifically mentioned belief in Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. But there is more to that story. Here is what Charlie Kirk won't tell you. Delaware revised their constitution in 1792, just 4 years after the U.S. Constitution was ratified. Delaware's revised constitution adopted the same language regarding religious tests as did the federal Constitution. And here's that language. No religious test shall be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under this state. One of the reasons why what the states did with their religious test clauses turns out to be irrelevant is that the states followed the federal example in relatively short order. By 1833, most religious requirements for office in a state had been eliminated. The trend in the nation was toward religious freedom and acceptance of freedom of conscience, not against it. Instead of a proof of America as a Christian nation, Kirk's description of what states did at one time could be labeled a snapshot in time of how American states decided not to require Christianity as a state religion. Let me riff on that latter point of relevance. To do that, I'm going to adapt a section of The Christian Past That Wasn't from pages 94 to 95. The American continent was colonized by Europeans who believed God had empowered earthly kings to speak on his behalf. Many, if not most, had come to believe state support of religion was necessary to maintain a moral population. According to church historian Paul Kemeny, their thinking can be reduced to a syllogism. Quote, a Republican form of government needs virtuous citizens. Religion produces virtuous citizens. Therefore, the state should preserve the established church because it helps produce virtuous citizens. End quote. In keeping with this syllogism, during the 17th and 18th centuries, most colonies established a form of Christianity in civil law. That part of the claim is true, and I describe this in more detail in the book. However, in my view, the fact that most colonies established Christianity in some form is of limited relevance to questions about America's status as a Christian nation. Why? The legal structure of the United States after the formation of the Constitution is what governs us now. Influenced by their colonial experience and the history of Europe, the founders rejected the establishment of religion in the federal government. As reflected in the Constitution, the founders turned from the assumption that the state needed to enforce the Christian religion to promote virtues essential to the republic. According to Kemeny, the nation followed a bold new approach. Quote, the most efficacious means to nurture a virtuous citizenry was through religious liberty. In this new approach, the church, without government support, was deemed solely responsible for cultivating virtuous citizens. End quote. It wasn't that the government was opposed to religion. Rather, it placed religious judgments in the responsibility of an individual's conscience. Remember, Christian nationalists want to use the past, not understand it. They want to draw a straight line from state-level religious establishments to 21st century America. The problem for them is that states disestablished their religions and found religious liberty more attractive. Even then, the process of achieving religious liberty in all states was not linear. Some states, such as Rhode Island, started with complete religious freedom and then went through a period during which some restrictions were in place for Jews and Catholics. Other states, such as Connecticut, achieved religious disestablishment gradually. Here's my point. If you want to know what the founders as a group intended American church-state policy to look like, the constantly fluctuating state governments are not the place to look. It's hard for me to see how anything the founders did in their states before the Constitution was ratified has much weight in church-state disputes today. And so, not only was Kirk wrong about the colonial requirements, in my view, he put too much importance on the requirements that were in place. Having said that, and having shown that his facts were not accurate, I think it is important to add that I am not claiming that religion was unimportant during the founding era. That is not my argument, nor is that what happened. In the book, I quote historians Carl Esbeck and Jonathan Den Hartog, who say that a majority of Americans, quote, believed religion, as they experienced it, was instrumental to the formation of virtue, and virtue was instrumental to self-discipline of citizens thought necessary to sustain a republic. While I believe that is true, as I mentioned before, there is more to the story. At least among the founders who framed the charter documents, there was a deep respect for religious plurality, liberality, and tolerance. Those who advocated for disestablishment were convinced that, in theory, everyone had the freedom to worship God in the ways they deemed proper. Disestablishment allowed religion in general terms to flourish while preserving individual liberty. Founders such as James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, and Ben Franklin thought religion, if true and valuable, did not need the aid of civil powers. Franklin said it this way to Richard Price in an October 1780 letter, quote, "When a religion is good, I conceive that it will support itself. And when it cannot support itself, and God does not take care to support, so that its professors are obliged to call for help of the civil power, 'tis a sign, I apprehend, of it being a bad one." End quote. In Chapter 4 of the book, I highlight two broad approaches to church and state in the American colonies. While most states had religious establishments, not all did. The divergence in viewpoints on the matter went back to the very beginning of the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 1630s. This is important in my mind because Christian nationalists want to minimize the fact that there were competing trends, one toward separation of church and state, and the other toward religious establishment. In the book, I contrast Roger Williams and John Winthrop as emblematic of these traditions. The more dominant approach at the time sprung from Puritan New England and united church and state. The Massachusetts way sought to promote a virtuous society by means of merging civil and ecclesiastical law. However, at nearly the same time, another way developed due to the teaching of Roger Williams. Also a Puritan, Williams believed the garden of the church should be separated from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. As historian Randall Balmer put it, quote, "Wilderness for them was a place of danger where evil lurked. So when Roger Williams talked about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, He was eager to maintain the integrity of the faith, lest it be corrupted by too close an association with the state. End quote. Listen to Balmer talk more about Williams.
For me, Roger Williams is still such a central character in this whole narrative. Roger Williams, of course, was a Puritan who very quickly ran afoul of the Puritan authorities in Massachusetts because he objected to the interleaving of church and state. And Roger Williams is also responsible for this metaphor that we use all the time. That is the separation of the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world by means of a wall of separation. Now, what's lost in that metaphor, it seems to me, with our modern sensibilities, is the fact that Roger Williams and his contemporaries were not members of the Sierra Club. That is to say, they did not share our romantic notions about wilderness. Wilderness for them was a place of danger where evil lurked. And so when Roger Williams talks about separating the garden of the church from the wilderness of the world, he is eager to maintain the integrity of the faith, lest it be corrupted by too close an association with the state.
Born in England around 1603, Williams grew up during the reign of King James. Converted early in life, Williams attended Pembroke College to study theology and entered the ministry after graduation. In 1625, Charles I came to power. Charles had little tolerance for those who wanted to purge the Church of England of all Roman Catholic elements, or as they became known, the Puritans. Charles empowered church authorities to persecute those who deviated from church policy. The year 1629 became one of decision for many Puritans. John Winthrop was given an opportunity to lead an organization called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Historian E.S. Gostad says it is very likely that Winthrop and Williams became acquainted during that year and discussed a possible future journey to New England. In early April 1630, Winthrop led a party bound for Salem Harbor, followed by Roger and Mary Williams 8 months later. Along with 20 other passengers, including 2 of my ancestors, John and Rebecca Throckmorton, they landed at Nantasket on February 5, 1631. Winthrop was glad to greet them. In his journal, he referred to Williams as, quote, a godly minister, end quote. Upon his arrival in Boston, Williams was temporarily offered the post as pastor of the church at Boston. The regular pastor, John Wilson, had gone back to England to bring his wife to Boston. To Winthrop's surprise, Williams turned it down because the church was still affiliated with the Church of England. Williams believed in a fully separated church, one untainted by compromise with the state religion of the King's Church. Williams expounded on the idea that church and state should be separate. He questioned the right of the civil authorities to enforce religious edicts. Williams denied that the state could enforce religious commandments to love God, avoid blasphemy, or keep the Sabbath. These are matters of conscience, he believed, which the state must leave to the church. This was too much for the Massachusetts authorities. Dissenting religious views were not tolerated. Williams came before the Massachusetts Council 4 times between 1632 and 1635. In October 1635, because of his religious views, he was sentenced to banishment from the colony and commanded not to preach. Because of illness and the coming winter, he was given additional time to leave. While waiting for winter to break, a group of followers gathered at his home to pray with him. Williams continued to exhort and encourage about 24 of his supporters. These meetings worried the authorities due to concern that Williams would incite a rebellion. Some wanted to execute him. Because of the perception that he was disobeying the injunction not to preach, in January 1636, the magistrates decided to send him back to England as soon as possible. When the council summoned him to Boston, 2 physicians attested that he was too sick to travel to Boston and certainly not well enough to take a ship to England. His supporters petitioned the governor's council on his behalf, but found no mercy. The council wanted him out of Massachusetts and issued an order for Williams to be cast on the boat. As the soldiers prepared to travel to Salem, a massive storm stopped them. While they waited to move, Winthrop sent a warning to Williams to flee the colony. Yes, Winthrop. Although he disagreed with Williams, Winthrop believed him to be a well-intentioned Puritan and did not want to see him die on a harsh winter voyage to England. Instead, in January 1636, Williams left Massachusetts in a dreadful winter without a sure destination. Abandoned by Puritans, he lived only by shelter of the indigenous people. Williams lived with Native Americans of one tribe or another for 14 weeks until spring and settled in what is now Providence, Rhode Island. He was joined by his wife and children and faithful like-minded friends to settle Providence with land he obtained from the Narragansett tribe. It was in Providence that the first government of any jurisdiction was established with full religious freedom. To serve or participate in that settlement, one did not need to make any religious oath or have any whiff of Puritan orthodoxy. The church and citizens' religious opinions and commitments were completely separate from the civil government. The contrast between Winthrop's Massachusetts and Williams' Rhode Island was sharp and meaningful. The actions of Williams and those who followed him to Rhode Island merit further description. Their governmental agreement, written and agreed to in 1638, was simple and relevant, quote, only in civil things, end quote. The agreement did not require any religious test or creed. Quote, we whose names are hereunder, desirous to inhabit in the town of Providence, do promise to subject ourselves in active or passive obedience to all such orders or agreements as shall be made for public good of the body in an orderly way, by the major assent of the present inhabitants, masters of families, incorporated together into a town fellowship, and such others whom they shall admit unto them only in civil things. End quote. The citizens of Providence committed themselves again to religious liberty in a more complex 1640 agreement affirming, quote, we agree as formerly hath been the liberties of the town, so still to hold forth liberty of conscience. End quote. With this simple phrase, the colony at Rhode Island agreed to conduct civil business without regard to the religious views of the citizens. Of all that had transpired in the colonies up to that point, this was arguably the greatest civil innovation, individual liberty of conscience for all citizens. No one in Rhode Island had to fear banishment or worse on account of their religious views. Not only that, but citizens were able to fully participate in the civil life of the colony. Although it took Williams many years, he was able to convince the British government to give Rhode Island a charter. This protected their religious freedom. In part, the colony, quote, freely declared that it is much on their hearts, if they may be permitted, to hold forth a lively experiment, that a most flourishing civil state may stand and best be maintained, and that among our English subjects with a full liberty in religious concernments. End quote. In other words, the civil rights of Rhode Islanders were not dependent on their religious affiliation. Along with the earlier documents written by Williams and his fellow citizens, the charter provided that religious freedom, unheard of anywhere else, was a feature of daily civil life in Rhode Island. When Claiborne Pell, senator from Rhode Island, dedicated a national park in honor of Williams in Providence on October 8, 1984, he said that in 1636, 13 families came together to create, quote, the first genuine democracy, also the first church-divorced and conscience-free community in modern history, end quote. What an incredible story. Surely, innovating separation of church and state should be told along with the story of the Puritans coming to a new land to seek religious freedom for themselves. It is important to note the differences in how the two colonies approached church and state. In Massachusetts, people were persecuted for deviating from the religious beliefs of the colony. That was not the case in Rhode Island. In the book, The Christian Past That Wasn't, I say a lot more about this. Beginning in 1656, Massachusetts authorities implemented various penalties for Quakers who refused to leave the colony. Quakers were whipped, had their ears cut off, and had holes burned in their tongues. But Quakers continued to enter the colony, so the authorities implemented the death penalty. Between 1659 and 1660, 4 Quakers were hung in Boston Commons. Although the persecution wasn't as severe, Baptists were also persecuted as dissenters. They were beaten and their faith declared illegal. In Rhode Island, there were no hangings. In fact, all groups, including Quakers, were active in the government. That is not to say that Williams was fine with the Society of Friends. In fact, he thought Quakers were heretics. Even his, quote, former ancient neighbor and friend, end quote, and my ancestor, John Throckmorton, experienced Williams' wrath over Throckmorton's conversion to the Society of Friends. In 1672, the two Providence neighbors and veterans of the journey from England to Boston exchanged heated letters over Quaker teachings. However, even though Throckmorton disagreed publicly with Williams, there were no civil consequences for Quakers or any other religious minorities expressing their views. If Throckmorton had expressed those sentiments publicly to a prominent Puritan in Massachusetts during the mid-1600s, he might have suffered the same fate as the Boston martyrs. However, the only result in Rhode Island was a rebuke from Williams. Williams and Throckmorton exchanged more angry letters and apparently became estranged over the matter. But no matter how much Williams or any other Rhode Island civil leader disliked them, Throckmorton and the other Quakers did not need to worry about losing their ears, their tongues, their votes, or their lives. The lively experiment in Rhode Island ensured their safety and freedom. Happily, it was the Williams way that won out in the United States. The phrase separation of church and state was later used by President Thomas Jefferson as shorthand for the First Amendment in an 1802 letter to Baptist ministers who were laboring under the domination of a state church in Connecticut. In his letter, Jefferson acknowledged that the federal government had enshrined separation of church and state in federal law and supported the Danbury Baptists who wanted to see religious liberty come to their state. Eventually it did, when Connecticut disestablished the Congregationalist Church in 1818. Ultimately, the lasting American innovation is the separation of church and state, what historian Randall Balmer calls America's best idea. Christian nationalists today want us to believe the founders wanted a Christian republic when in fact the Constitution and the First Amendment built on the foundation of Roger Williams' firm insistence that the church and state are best served when they are kept apart. To best protect the rights of all religions, majority and minority alike, we need to work to preserve the American heritage of religious liberty and toleration. Those of you who have purchased The Christian Past That Wasn't may recognize some of today's podcast. I adapted some of today's narration from Chapter 4 of the book. If you haven't yet bought the book, today would be a great day to make your purchase. You can find many good options at christianpast.com. That's christianpast.com. If you like shopping at Barnes & Noble, they are carrying the book on the shelves. Music today was provided by Netop, Jonas Fair, and Jeremiah Lawson. The closing song is It's Okay by Netop. Be sure to tell a friend about the podcast. Please leave us a lovely rating. Thanks for listening.